On the night of March 16, 2019, a chilling crime took place in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Port Jefferson, New York. At approximately 10:45 p.m., a 911 call was received by the Suffolk County Police Department, reporting a violent altercation at a residence located on Oakwood Avenue. The caller, who identified themselves as a neighbor, claimed to have heard loud noises coming from the home of 45-year-old Gregory Adams, a local accountant, and had seen what appeared to be a struggle through the window. When officers arrived at the scene, they were met with a disturbing sight. The front door to the residence had been forced open, and there were signs of a violent struggle in the living room. Furniture was overturned, and a broken vase lay in pieces across the floor. It quickly became apparent that something far more sinister had occurred. Inside the house, police discovered Gregory Adams lying unconscious in a pool of blood, his body showing signs of blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds. The man's face was unrecognizable due to the severity of the injuries, and it appeared that he had been attacked with a sharp object, likely a knife. The scene was chaotic, with broken glass scattered across the floor, and a trail of blood leading from the living room into the hallway. Emergency medical services arrived shortly after the police and immediately began performing life-saving measures on Adams. However, despite their best efforts, Gregory Adams was pronounced dead at the scene. The brutality of the attack left investigators with few clues as to who could have committed such an atrocious crime. A thorough search of the residence revealed no signs of forced entry beyond the front door, leading authorities to believe that the victim may have known the attacker. There was no indication that anything of value had been stolen, and nothing appeared out of place in terms of property. This led investigators to suspect that the motive for the crime was not robbery, but something much more personal. Detective Emily Sanders, who was called in to lead the investigation, quickly began interviewing neighbors and anyone who might have known Adams. One neighbor mentioned seeing a woman leave the residence around 9:30 p.m. that night. She was described as being of average height, with short dark hair and wearing a red jacket. The neighbor was unsure of who she was, but they had never seen her at the house before. The search for this mysterious woman became the focus of the investigation, as police worked to gather more information. However, as the hours turned into days, it became clear that this crime was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. As the investigation continued into the following days, Detective Sanders and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the circumstances surrounding Gregory Adams's brutal murder. With no clear suspect and very few clues to work with, they began to explore every potential lead. The first significant lead came when officers were able to trace the red jacket seen on the mysterious woman by the neighbor. Through security footage from a nearby convenience store, they were able to identify the woman as Emily Parker, a 33-year-old former colleague of Gregory Adams. The footage, which was taken just an hour before the attack, showed Parker leaving the store and walking in the direction of Oakwood Avenue. Her presence at the scene was now undeniable. Detective Sanders wasted no time in tracking down Emily Parker. After several attempts to contact her, Parker finally agreed to speak with investigators, though she denied any involvement in the crime. She explained that she had worked with Adams years prior at a financial firm, but had not seen him for a long time. According to Parker, she had simply been in the area to meet a friend. But when asked about the nature of her relationship with Adams, her answers were vague and inconsistent. The inconsistencies in Parker's story immediately raised red flags. When Sanders pressed her further, Parker revealed that she and Adams had maintained a brief but intense romantic relationship several years before. However, she insisted that they had parted ways amicably, claiming that she had no reason to harm him. She explained that she had come to the neighborhood to talk about their past, seeking closure. Still, the police were skeptical of her story, particularly after her increasingly erratic behavior during the questioning. As the investigation deepened, it was discovered that Adams had recently been involved in a bitter legal battle. 2 months prior to his death, he had filed a restraining order against Parker, claiming that she had been harassing him. Friends and colleagues of Adams reported that Parker had become obsessed with him, frequently showing up at his workplace and at his home. Despite his clear attempts to distance himself from her, Parker's obsession with Adams had reportedly escalated after he ended their relationship, and the restraining order had been the final attempt by Adams to put a stop to her behavior. He had even gone as far as to change his phone number and move to a different residence in an effort to avoid any contact. However, the restraining order had not been enough to keep Parker away, and authorities began to consider her the prime suspect in his murder. Parker's obsession with Adams had reportedly escalated after he ended their relationship, and the restraining order had been the final attempt by Adams to put a stop to her behavior. He had even gone as far as to change his phone discovery of the restraining order, along with her suspicious presence near the crime scene, shifted the investigation in Parker's direction. However, there were still many unanswered questions. Despite the mounting evidence, there was no direct link between Parker and the murder weapon. No fingerprints, DNA, or other physical evidence had been found at the scene that could definitively tie her to the crime. Detective Sanders decided to revisit the crime scene and re-examine the evidence. One detail that had initially been overlooked was a set of footprints found outside the house. The prints were distinctive, too, small to be Adams, and leading away from the residence toward the street. The footprints led to a nearby wooded area, which was a few blocks away from the house. The next step was to search that area thoroughly. The search of the wooded area began on March 20th, 2019, just a few days after the discovery of the mysterious footprints. The area, which was thick with trees and brush, was not far from Gregory Adams' home, but it had been largely overlooked in the initial investigation. It was a quiet spot, away from the main roads, and seemed like an unlikely place for a suspect to leave traces. Yet the footprints had led them here, and Detective Sanders was determined to find something that could connect Emily Parker to the crime. The team methodically scoured the woods, covering every inch of ground. It wasn't until the afternoon, when the light began to fade, that they found something. Hidden beneath a thick patch of underbrush was a dark, blood-stained jacket, identical to the one described by the neighbor. Upon closer inspection, the jacket appeared to have been discarded hastily, as if the owner had been in a hurry to get rid of it. There was no doubt it had been the same red jacket seen in the convenience store footage. The jacket was sent to the lab for a forensic analysis, and it didn't take long for the results to come in. The blood on the jacket was a match for Gregory Adams, confirming that it had been worn by someone involved in his murder. However, what they found next stunned them. Embedded within the fabric of the jacket were tiny traces of skin and hair, which, after further examination, were identified as being consistent with Emily Parker's DNA. This new evidence brought her even closer to the crime. On March 22nd, Detective Sanders and her team brought Emily Parker in for another round of questioning. This time they confronted her with the newly discovered evidence. As expected, Parker denied any involvement in the murder, but her reactions during the interrogation became increasingly defensive and erratic. When she was shown photos of the jacket and told about the forensic findings, Parker's demeanor shifted from denial to panic. Parker's behavior was telling. She became more agitated, nervously shifting in her seat and refusing to make eye contact. The police asked her to explain how her DNA had ended up on the jacket found near the crime scene. Parker's initial response was that she had no idea how it could have happened. However, as the pressure mounted, she finally admitted to being in the woods that night. But her explanation was even more bizarre. She claimed she had gone there to calm down after an argument with Adams, but she denied ever being inside his home, despite her odd statements. The mounting evidence against Parker was becoming undeniable. The presence of her DNA on the jacket, along with her history of harassment toward Adams and her erratic behavior at the crime scene, placed her at the center of the investigation. Sanders knew they were on the brink of solving the case, but they still needed one crucial piece of the puzzle: Parker's motive. During a final round of questioning, Detective Sanders pressed Parker further about her relationship with Adams. With little choice but to admit the truth, Parker finally revealed the full extent of her obsession. She had never truly gotten over their past relationship, and the restraining order had only fueled her anger and frustration. She had convinced herself that Adams was the only person who could give her the closure she needed, and in a twisted moment of desperation, she decided to confront him. On the night of March 16th, Parker had gone to Adams's house under the pretense of seeking closure. However, once inside, the conversation quickly turned hostile. Parker became enraged when Adams rejected her once again, accusing her of ruining his life. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a knife from the kitchen and attacked him. What followed was a violent and brutal assault. Adams fought back, but Parker overpowered him. stabbing him repeatedly until he fell unconscious. Afterward, she left in a daze, and in her panic, discarded the bloody jacket in the woods. Parker's confession shocked the investigators, but it wasn't enough to explain her actions fully. The obsession that had driven her to such violence was fueled by years of emotional turmoil, rejection, and delusion. She had become convinced that she could somehow force Adams to reconcile with her. But when that didn't happen, the tragic result was murder. The arrest of Emily Parker sent shockwaves through the small community of Port Jefferson. What had initially seemed like an inexplicable, random act of violence had, in fact, been the result of a long-running obsession and a tragic culmination of unresolved emotions. Parker was charged with second-degree murder, and her trial began in the fall of 2019. As the case went to trial, the prosecution presented a compelling argument. The evidence, Parker's DNA on the bloodied jacket, her presence near the crime scene, her history of harassment, and her confession, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. In court, the prosecution painted Parker as a woman driven by obsession, unable to let go of a relationship that had ended years ago. The defense, however, argued that Parker had not intended to kill Adams, but had acted in the heat of the moment. During an emotional confrontation, they suggested that Parker's mental state had been affected by her fixation on Adams and the emotional toll of his rejection. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury found Emily Parker guilty of second-degree murder. In their deliberations, they concluded that Parker had gone to Adams's home with the intent to confront him and that her actions, though impulsive, had ultimately led to the tragic death of an innocent man. The judge sentenced Parker to 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case had a profound impact on the community. Neighbors and friends of Gregory Adams struggled to come to terms with the senselessness of his death. Adams was remembered as a kind and hardworking man who had tried to move on from a toxic chapter in his life, only to become a victim of a woman unable to let go of the past. His family, devastated by the loss, sought solace in the fact that justice had been served, though they would never fully recover from the traumatic events. The case also sparked discussions about the dangers of obsessive relationships and the psychological toll that rejection can have on an individual. Experts in the field of psychology noted that Emily Parker's behavior was indicative of what is known as obsessive relational intrusion, ORI, a condition where an individual becomes fixated on another person to an unhealthy extent. In Parker's case, this fixation escalated to violence, culminating in a tragic death. In the end, the case of Gregory Adams' murder served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unaddressed emotional trauma and the consequences of obsession. Emily Parker's inability to accept the end of her relationship with Adams led to a chain of events that forever altered the lives of both families involved. Next, stories 2. In April 2020, the disappearance and subsequent murder of U.S. Army soldier Vanessa Guillen captivated the nation. Vanessa Guillen, a 20-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, went missing on April 22, 2020. She had been last seen in a barracks building at the military base where she was working her usual shift. Vanessa was a bright and hardworking young woman who had dreamed of serving in the Army. Her disappearance raised immediate concerns, as it was highly unusual for her to not contact her family or friends. The U.S. Army initiated an investigation, but it wasn't until nearly 2 months later that the full details of her death were revealed, sparking outrage and calls for justice. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Vanessa had been the victim of harassment and inappropriate behavior by a fellow soldier, Aaron David Robinson, who had been stationed at Fort Hood with her. Vanessa had confided in her family and friends about the sexual harassment she had been enduring from Robinson, but she had not officially reported it at the time. Robinson reportedly made lewd comments toward her and had been making her feel uncomfortable for several months. The investigation into Vanessa's disappearance took a disturbing turn when human remains were found near the Leon River in Texas on June 30, 2020. The remains were later identified as belonging to Vanessa Guillen. Authorities determined that she had been bludgeoned to death with a hammer by Aaron Robinson in the Army base's armory room. After killing Vanessa, Robinson had dismembered her body and attempted to hide the remains. Robinson, realizing the severity of his actions, fled the base and went on the run. However, he was tracked down by law enforcement on July 1, 2020, When confronted, Robinson took his own life before he could be taken into custody. The case sparked outrage not only because of the brutal murder, but also because of the apparent cover-up that had taken place within the military. Investigators revealed that Robinson's fellow soldiers had been aware of the harassment Vanessa had been subjected to, and that there had been a failure in addressing her complaints. This led to increased scrutiny of the military's handling of sexual harassment and misconduct. Vanessa's family, led by her mother, Gloria Guillen, fought for justice for their daughter. The incident led to widespread protests and calls for reform in the military. In July 2020, the U.S. Senate passed the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, which aimed to address the military's handling of sexual harassment and provide more transparency and support for soldiers facing abuse. The discovery of Vanessa Guillen's body and the tragic circumstances surrounding her death created a wave of national outrage, sparking protests and calls for accountability. Her family, especially her mother, Gloria Guillen, became vocal advocates for justice, leading the charge to demand answers from the U.S. military regarding their mishandling of Vanessa's case. Gloria and other family members fought tirelessly to bring attention to the larger issue of sexual harassment within the military and the failure of the system to protect women like her daughter. Vanessa's case not only highlighted a heinous act of violence, but also exposed systemic issues within the military. The Guillen family alleged that Vanessa had been a victim of sexual harassment and had reported it to others, but no action had been taken. This failure to address her complaints, coupled with the military's slow response to her disappearance, fueled the growing frustration among those demanding change. The movement that followed became a rallying cry for military reform, with the hashtag #IamVanessaGuillen trending on social media. Thousands of people, including active duty service members, veterans and civilians, voiced their support for the Guillen family and called for an end to the culture of silence and abuse in the military. The protests gained traction as more people shared their own stories of harassment, creating a powerful wave of solidarity. In response to the public outcry, lawmakers took action. In late July 2020, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and Representative Jackie Speier introduced the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act in Congress. The legislation aimed to address the shortcomings of the military justice system, particularly regarding how sexual harassment and misconduct are handled. Key provisions of the bill included independent oversight, a provision to create an independent office outside of the chain of command to investigate allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct, ensuring that victims would not face retaliation or fear of reporting. Command accountability. The bill sought to hold commanders accountable for failures to address or act on complaints of sexual harassment and assault within their units. Improved reporting mechanisms. Push for better reporting systems that protect victims' identities and prevent retaliation. The I Am Vanessa Guillen Act garnered widespread support and, in some form, spurred important changes within the military, though the journey toward systemic reform is ongoing. Many lawmakers and advocates argued that the bill was just the beginning, and more needs to be done to address the deeply ingrained issues of abuse, retaliation, and misconduct within military institutions. Additionally, public pressure led to investigations into other military bases, particularly Fort Hood, where several other suspicious deaths and allegations of misconduct had been reported. Fort Hood itself became a focal point for the failures within the military justice system, and the Army conducted a review of its practices in light of Vanessa's death. The reforms that followed Vanessa's tragic passing were a small step toward addressing the larger issue of sexual violence in the military. But her death was a stark reminder of the need for cultural and institutional change to protect those who serve. Her story helped shine a light on the serious consequences of failing to take action against harassment and violence and demonstrated the power of grassroots activism in demanding justice. In the months following Vanessa's death, numerous memorials and tributes were held in her honor. Her family, led by Gloria Guillen, continued to advocate for justice, ensuring that Vanessa's story was not forgotten. They pushed for both accountability for those responsible for her death and broader reforms that would make the military a safer place for women. Despite the overwhelming sadness of her death, Vanessa's legacy lived on through the movement that grew around her case. Her name became synonymous with the fight against sexual harassment and assault in the military, and her case inspired a nationwide conversation about the need for systemic change in institutions that have long been resistant to reform. Vanessa Guillen's tragic story continues to resonate deeply with many, particularly within military circles and the broader community of women who have experienced harassment and assault. Despite the pain her family and friends endured, Vanessa's death sparked a transformation in how the U.S. military began to confront these issues. The momentum gained through the Vanessa Guillen movement ultimately led to a shift in policy, though it was just the beginning of a much larger, long-term fight for justice and equality. The widespread public outrage following the details of Vanessa's murder catalyzed a unique and poignant form of advocacy. Her mother, Gloria Guillen, played an instrumental role in keeping the pressure on both military leaders and elected officials. Gloria became the voice of many families who felt their loved ones' voices had been silenced by bureaucratic inefficiencies or worse, indifference. Vanessa's story became a symbol of the broader, systemic failures in how the military handles allegations of sexual harassment and violence, especially when victims are women. In a 2020 interview, Gloria Guillen made it clear that her fight for justice wasn't just for her daughter. It was for all the women who suffer in silence within the military, afraid of retaliation or disbelief. She called for more than just an investigation into her daughter's death. She demanded the eradication of a culture that perpetuated sexual violence and punished the victims who came forward. The impact of Vanessa's case reached far beyond the military. Across the United States, there were marches, protests, and public hearings aimed at ensuring that her death would not be in vain. Activists rallied under the banner of I am Vanessa Guillen, using her name as both a call to action and a solemn remembrance of the harsh reality faced by women in uniform. The Guillen family's advocacy also prompted significant shifts within the Department of Defense. Though the military had long been criticized for its mishandling of sexual harassment and assault cases, it was clear that Vanessa's death was a turning point. The Army conducted a series of reviews and audits on Fort Hood, where Vanessa had been stationed. The findings revealed a disturbing pattern of unaddressed issues related to sexual misconduct, neglect of soldiers' well-being, and an overall toxic environment. In response, senior leadership within the Army vowed to address these problems more directly. Though there were promises made to protect future victims, many still see the military's reforms as insufficient. The focus shifted not only to the systems of reporting harassment, but also to the culture of command within the military. Commanders and leadership were encouraged, but not always required, to take direct responsibility for fostering a respectful environment for all personnel, particularly women. Despite some progress, the fight for justice for Vanessa is far from over. While Vanessa's death catalyzed significant conversations about the need for reform, the military justice system still faces criticisms about its handling of sexual assault and harassment claims. Her case has become a powerful symbol for ongoing battles within the armed forces, where victims often feel trapped within a system that lacks transparency and accountability. Many advocates continue to call for independent civilian oversight of military cases, as many victims fear retaliation when reporting misconduct within their units. The family's fight for justice was further strengthened by congressional hearings where they voiced the need for systemic change. Senators like Kirsten Gillibrand and Jackie Speier continued to champion the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, a bill that sought to bring about the very reforms needed to protect military personnel. One of the most significant aspects of the act is its focus on ensuring that victims of sexual harassment and assault in the military have access to impartial investigators outside their chain of command. This was a pivotal concern, as many soldiers have reported retaliation or fear of retribution when reporting incidents to their commanders. Vanessa's family continued to advocate for this reform, insisting that the military's internal structure was inherently flawed and incapable of providing justice for victims. Vanessa's final resting place in memory. In the months that followed Vanessa's death, memorials were held across the country in her honor. Her burial site at the Forest Park East Cemetery in Houston, Texas, became a place of reflection for those who knew her, as well as for many who had followed her story. Her memorial is marked by a plaque inscribed with the words, "Gone but never forgotten." Vanessa's name has since become a rallying cry for military reform, and her memory lives on in the movement she unwittingly started. Her legacy has inspired not just legislation but a broader societal understanding of the pervasive issues of sexual misconduct in institutions of power. Thousands of women who felt alone in their own experiences have found strength in Vanessa's story. In 2021, the Guillen family was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a testament to their tireless efforts in seeking justice for Vanessa and the many others who have faced similar struggles. The Guillen family has continued to stand as advocates for military reform, and their work has undoubtedly made a lasting impact on how sexual harassment cases are viewed in the military. Vanessa Guillen's case reverberated beyond the confines of the military and prompted a major cultural shift. As public outrage grew, attention was drawn to the broader issues of sexual violence and harassment, not just within military structures but across various sectors, including law enforcement, education, and private industries. While the U.S. military is a unique institution, its struggles with harassment and misconduct mirrored those of other organizations that have historically been slow to address these problems. The activism surrounding Vanessa's story highlighted a fundamental shift in the way that victims of harassment and abuse are viewed, not only as individuals but also as part of a larger societal issue. Her story became an emblematic case of how individuals, especially women, face silencing or dismissiveness when they try to report misconduct in patriarchal or hierarchical systems. The I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, a groundbreaking push for change. In the wake of the widespread protests and legislative push sparked by Vanessa's case, lawmakers intensified their efforts to pass the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act. Introduced in 2020, the bill sought to address the systemic problems within the military justice system, especially the handling of sexual assault and harassment allegations. Key elements of the proposed act included establishment of independent investigators. One of the primary provisions was the creation of independent investigators who would handle cases of sexual harassment and assault. This measure aimed to remove the conflicts of interest that arose when accusations were made within a victim's chain of command. By allowing outside personnel to manage investigations, it was hoped that victims would be more inclined to report incidents without fear of retaliation or bias from commanders. Reform of the military justice system. The bill proposed restructuring how military sexual assault cases are prosecuted, giving commanders less influence over the decisions made in these cases. Traditionally, military commanders had the authority to determine whether or not a case should be pursued. This concentration of power in the hands of those who could be biased, either through personal or institutional loyalty, was seen as a core issue in why many sexual harassment and assault claims went unaddressed. Protection for whistleblowers. The act aimed to protect military personnel who speak out about misconduct by providing stronger whistleblower protections. It sought to eliminate the fear of retaliation that many soldiers felt when considering reporting harassment or abuse. While these legislative efforts were monumental, they were only the beginning. The law's passage was widely seen as a necessary step, but many advocates made it clear that it would require ongoing vigilance and commitment to ensure meaningful and lasting reform. The military, with its entrenched institutional culture, would need to undergo a significant transformation to create a truly safe and respectful environment for all its members, especially women. Broader social movements and empowerment. The outcry following Vanessa's death coincided with the Me Too movement, which had been gaining traction for several years prior. The Me Too movement, which emerged as a way for women to publicly share their experiences of sexual harassment and assault, resonated deeply with the public in the wake of Vanessa's case. The idea that women were no longer willing to tolerate abuse and silence became central to the fight for justice in the military, as well as in other sectors of society. Within the military, the tragic death of Vanessa Guillen provided the spark for a broader reckoning with the endemic issues of sexual harassment and gender inequality. It highlighted the need for systemic change and greater accountability for institutions that had long been resistant to addressing such issues. Military personnel, both men and women, who had lived in silence with their own experiences of harassment, began to feel empowered to share their stories. A renewed commitment to safe spaces for women in the military. For many women in the armed forces, Vanessa Guillen's story underscored a crucial point: the need for women to feel safe and supported in a system that was supposed to protect and serve the country. For decades, women in the military had faced an uphill battle against harassment, mistreatment, and discrimination. The power dynamics of the military, often dominated by men in leadership positions, created an environment in which women's voices were frequently overlooked or silenced. The push for women's safety in the military gained significant momentum after Vanessa's death. Veteran groups, feminist organizations, and other advocacy groups began to collaborate with lawmakers to push for even more protections and reforms. These groups advocated for more representation of women in leadership roles, more training on preventing sexual harassment, and the dismantling of toxic masculinities that too often perpetuated abuse. Vanessa's family, from grief to advocacy. The Guillen family's role in all of this cannot be overstated. Despite the overwhelming grief of losing their daughter, they became fierce advocates for military reform. Gloria Guillen, in particular, emerged as a powerful voice calling for action on behalf of victims and their families. She demanded a more transparent and accountable military system that would better protect soldiers from harm. The family's advocacy led them to meet with high-ranking officials and lawmakers, continuing to push for justice for their daughter. Their persistence not only helped catalyze legislative change, but also inspired many others who had experienced similar traumas to find their voice. Through their efforts, the Guillen family helped ensure that Vanessa's legacy would be one of change, a legacy not just defined by her tragic death, but also by the monumental shifts in how sexual harassment and assault would be addressed in the military moving forward. Next, Stories 3. On the night of June 12, 2020, Rayshard Brooks, a 27-year-old black man, was parked in his car in the drive-thru lane of a Wendy's fast food restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia. The restaurant employees had noticed that the car was stopped for an unusually long time, preventing other customers from being served. After attempts to make contact with the driver went unanswered, they called the police to report a suspected drunk driver. Police officers Garrett Rolfe and Devin Brosnan arrived at the scene at around 10:30 p.m. They approached the vehicle, which was still running, and found Brooks asleep in the driver's seat. According to police reports, the officers initially tried to wake him up by knocking on the car window. After several moments, Brooks eventually woke up and was informed of the situation. The officers noted that Brooks appeared to be disoriented but polite. He acknowledged that he had been drinking, which led the officers to suspect he was intoxicated. Brooks was asked to step out of the vehicle and submit to a field sobriety test. He complied without resistance. The officers then administered a series of tests to assess his level of impairment, including asking him to walk in a straight line and stand on one leg. Following the tests, it was determined that Brooks was indeed intoxicated. Officers proceeded to inform him that he was being placed under arrest for driving under the influence, DUI. At this point, the situation took a turn. Brooks, while initially cooperative, suddenly became agitated. He struggled with the officers when they attempted to handcuff him. A brief but intense physical altercation ensued between Brooks and the two officers, with Brooks attempting to break free from their grip. In the heat of the moment, Brooks was able to grab one of the officers' tasers from its holster. Despite officers' commands to drop the weapon, Brooks began to flee on foot. As he ran away, he turned and pointed the taser toward the officers, in what they later claimed was an attempt to use the weapon against them. Officer Garrett Rolfe, fearing that he was in imminent danger, drew his firearm and fired 3 shots at Brooks, hitting him twice in the back. The shots caused Brooks to collapse to the ground just a few feet away from the officers. Seconds after being shot, Brooks was rushed to a nearby hospital, but he died from his injuries hours later. His tragic death was captured on video by a bystander, which would later become a central piece of evidence in the investigation. The video footage showed the heartbreaking moment that Brooks was shot in the back while running away from the officers. The fact that he was fleeing and not actively posing a threat raised serious questions about whether the use of deadly force was justified. The video, which quickly went viral, sparked outrage not only in Atlanta but across the country. In the wake of the shooting, protests erupted outside the Wendy's where the incident occurred. Demonstrators gathered to demand justice for Brooks, and tensions grew as the video circulated online. Many of the protesters were angry over what they perceived as another unjust killing of a black man at the hands of law enforcement. For many, this incident was yet another example of the systemic racism that had long plagued American policing. As the protests intensified, the situation at the Wendy's escalated further. The restaurant itself was set on fire by some of the demonstrators. The arson became a symbol of the anger and frustration that so many felt about the continued use of excessive force by police officers, particularly against people of color. In a statement, the Atlanta Police Department confirmed that the restaurant had been burned down. and that they were investigating the incident. In response to public pressure and the demands for justice, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms called for an independent investigation into the incident. On June 17, 2020, less than a week after the shooting, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office announced that criminal charges would be filed against the officers involved. Officer Garrett Rolfe was fired from the Atlanta Police Department and charged with 11 counts, including felony murder and aggravated assault. Rolfe faced charges of felony murder because it was believed that his actions in shooting Brooks were unjustifiable. Officer Devin Brosnan, who had been present during the incident but did not fire his weapon, was also charged with aggravated assault in violation of his oath of office. Brosnan was later placed on administrative duty, pending further investigation. The announcement of charges against the officers marked a significant moment in the national conversation about police violence. It was one of the few instances where police officers were charged in connection with a death caused by excessive force. However, the decision to charge the officers was not without controversy. Some members of the law enforcement community and their supporters argued that Rolfe acted in self-defense after Brooks had tried to use the taser against him, while others believed that the use of deadly force was excessive, especially considering that Brooks was running away and not directly threatening the officers. Despite the controversy, the charges represented a step toward greater accountability for police officers involved in incidents of deadly force. The case was closely watched by civil rights organizations and activists who had long advocated for systemic changes in policing, especially with regard to the treatment of Black Americans. The death of Rayshard Brooks was a pivotal moment in 2020, a year that had already seen the killings of other Black individuals, such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, by law enforcement officers. These deaths led to widespread protests and calls for changes in police practices. Brooks' killing, in particular, added fuel to the ongoing movement for police reform and justice for victims of police violence. In the aftermath of the shooting, Brooks's family members, including his widow, Tamika Miller, and his children, publicly spoke out about the pain of losing their loved one. Miller described how the family was devastated by his death, and she became a vocal advocate for justice. In addition to mourning their loss, the family joined the larger movement, calling for meaningful reform in how law enforcement interacts with minority communities. Miller and others became outspoken about the need to address systemic issues in policing, particularly the disproportionate use of force against Black people. On June 19, 2020, Rayshard Brooks' funeral was held in Atlanta, where hundreds of people gathered to mourn his death and honor his memory. The service was marked by powerful speeches and tributes from family members and activists. In her remarks, Miller urged the public to keep fighting for justice not just for her husband, but for all victims of police brutality. She spoke passionately about the need for accountability, while also calling for a transformation of the criminal justice system. The killing of Rayshard Brooks was a significant turning point in the larger movement against police brutality, sparking not only protests across Atlanta but also nationwide calls for justice and police reform. The incident occurred during a tumultuous period of civil unrest in the United States, with widespread protests demanding accountability for the deaths of Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement. The deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others had already galvanized activists and ignited national discussions about systemic racism and policing in America. Brooks's death further underscored the urgency of addressing these issues. After Rayshard Brooks was shot by Atlanta police officers, demonstrations erupted in multiple cities across the U.S. Protesters, many of whom were part of the broader Black Lives Matter movement, called for justice for Brooks and an end to the excessive use of force by law enforcement. The protests in Atlanta were especially intense, as they took place in the city where the tragedy occurred. Activists gathered outside the Wendy's where the incident took place, demanding that the officers involved be held accountable for their actions. Many protesters also advocated for broader reforms to address systemic racism within law enforcement agencies. Some protesters in Atlanta even blocked the streets in front of the Wendy's, marching in protest and chanting slogans like "Black Lives Matter." The arson of the Wendy's building, which was set on fire by some demonstrators, further amplified the public's outrage over Brooks' death. Across the nation, similar protests and rallies took place, not just in major cities but also in smaller towns. These protests reflected the deep-rooted anger and frustration that many Black Americans felt over the disproportionate violence and mistreatment they experienced at the hands of law enforcement. The ongoing protests were part of the broader demand for an end to racial injustice and the over-policing of black communities. In response to the growing unrest, local, state, and federal leaders were forced to address the issue of police violence. In Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms made a public statement calling for transparency and accountability, saying that we are better than this, and acknowledging the pain that the Brooks family, as well as the larger black community, was feeling. She urged the public to demand better from law enforcement, insisting that officers who violated their oath should be held accountable. In the weeks following the incident, Bottoms announced that the Atlanta Police Department had made significant changes in response to public pressure. One of the most immediate actions was the termination of Officer Garrett Rolfe, who had fired the fatal shots that killed Rayshard Brooks. Officer Devin Brosnan, who had also been present at the scene, was placed on administrative leave. These actions sent a message that the city was taking the matter seriously and that officers would be held accountable for their actions. At the same time, the incident spurred greater calls for reform at the state and national levels. In the days following Brooks's death, politicians across the country weighed in on the issue of police brutality and systemic racism. Some advocated for broad reforms, including measures to defund the police, which meant reallocating funds from police departments to social services and community programs. This idea, while controversial, gained traction in several cities, including Minneapolis, New York City, and Los Angeles. Several states and cities also introduced legislation aimed at reforming law enforcement practices, including proposals to ban chokeholds, mandate the use of body cameras by officers, and require police departments to implement de-escalation training. Some cities also introduced measures to limit the use of force by police officers and increase transparency in investigations of police misconduct. The death of Rayshard Brooks, along with the deaths of other high-profile victims of police violence, also led to the creation of new accountability structures. Many local governments created civilian oversight committees, tasked with reviewing complaints of police misconduct and ensuring that law enforcement agencies followed proper protocols in the treatment of civilians. These committees were part of the broader movement to hold police officers and police departments accountable for their actions. As the public continued to demand justice for Rayshard Brooks, the legal process began. On June 17, 2020, just 5 days after the shooting, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office announced that criminal charges would be filed against Officer Garrett Rolfe. Rolfe was charged with 11 counts, including felony murder, aggravated assault, and violation of his oath of office. The charges sparked mixed reactions. Civil rights groups and advocates for police reform hailed the decision as a step toward justice and accountability, while some law enforcement unions and their supporters argued that Rolfe acted in self-defense. Many argued that Rolfe's use of deadly force was not warranted, as Brooks was running away from the officers and did not pose an immediate threat. The video of the shooting, which showed Brooks being shot in the back while fleeing, became a focal point in the legal proceedings. Despite the charges, Officer Rolfe and Officer Brosnan were granted bail, and their legal teams began preparing their defense. The case became a high-profile legal battle that drew attention from both the public and the media. The trial was expected to be one of the most significant cases related to police violence in recent years, as it involved questions of whether the officers' actions were justified under the law. Throughout the legal proceedings, the family of Rayshard Brooks remained vocal in their pursuit of justice. Brooks' widow, Tamika Miller, became a prominent advocate for police reform and accountability. In interviews, Miller spoke about the pain of losing her husband and the need for systemic change in law enforcement. She emphasized that Brooks had been a loving father to their children and a hardworking man who did not deserve to die that night. Miller joined other civil rights advocates in pushing for legislation aimed at reducing police violence and creating more equitable policing practices. She also called for greater support for black families who had experienced similar tragedies and spoke out about the need to end the cycle of violence that had taken so many lives. The Brooks family established the Rayshard Brooks Foundation in his honor. The foundation's mission was to provide support for families impacted by police violence, promote education and youth empowerment, and advocate for reforms in law enforcement. The foundation's efforts became a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of tragedy and provided a way for Rayshard's legacy to live on. Through efforts to bring about positive change in the criminal justice system, Rayshard Brooks' death, like those before him, was a stark reminder of the deep-rooted racial inequalities in the United States. Particularly in the criminal justice system, his story became intertwined with the broader calls for justice and accountability that swept across the nation in 2020. His death did not only add to the rising number of victims of police violence, but also reinforced the urgency of addressing systemic racism. Brooks' killing occurred amid a cultural reckoning, following the deaths of other Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement, which had ignited protests, marches, and calls for change across the country. The immediate aftermath of the shooting saw intense media coverage, and the footage from the night of the incident was circulated widely, drawing attention to the circumstances surrounding the death of yet another unarmed Black man. The video, showing Brooks running from officers and being shot in the back while attempting to flee, became a symbol of the larger conversation about the use of excessive force by police officers, especially in interactions with Black individuals. This event took place at a time when public trust in law enforcement was already at an all-time low, particularly in communities of color. The killing of Rayshard Brooks, along with other tragic deaths, led to a revitalized movement for change. The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, which had already gained momentum following other high-profile cases such as the deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Tamir Rice, once again became a central force in the national discourse. The wave of protests that followed these incidents grew stronger. As more people came together to demand accountability for police violence, Brooks' case further pushed the conversation about police reform and the urgent need for structural changes within law enforcement. Protests in response to Brooks' death continued to surge across Atlanta and other cities, with many demonstrators organizing sit-ins, marches, and rallies. The atmosphere was one of both grief and determination. People from all walks of life came together to express their frustration over the lack of meaningful change within police departments. Many viewed Brooks's death as another glaring example of a system that disproportionately targeted Black Americans and other people of color. This tragedy, like those before it, symbolized the urgent need to address police brutality and transform policing practices. Despite the outcry, however, some police officers, public figures, and conservative media outlets supported the actions of the officers involved. They argued that the officers were justified in using deadly force because they believed Brooks was threatening them with a weapon. This division in public opinion highlighted the deep polarization in how law enforcement is viewed by different segments of American society. The broader discussion on police accountability and reform was complicated by conflicting beliefs about what constitutes proper use of force and whether the officers' actions were reasonable under the circumstances. Nevertheless, the national protest movement, which continued to gain momentum throughout the summer of 2020, prompted leaders to take more concrete steps toward reforming the justice system. The BLM movement and other advocacy groups began focusing not only on holding individual officers accountable, but also on addressing the broader structures that perpetuate inequality within law enforcement. There was a push for more thorough and comprehensive training for police officers in areas such as de-escalation techniques, mental health crisis intervention, and anti-racism education. Many advocates also called for more community-based approaches to public safety, which they argued could prevent police violence and reduce tensions between law enforcement and marginalized communities. The issue of police funding also became a focal point for many activists. Calls to defund the police gained traction across several cities, including Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and New York. While the term defund was often misunderstood and politicized, activists clarified that it did not mean eliminating police forces entirely, but rather reallocating funds from police departments to community services, such as mental health care, education, housing, and social work. This proposal sought to reduce the reliance on law enforcement to handle issues that might be better addressed through social programs and nonviolent interventions. The legal proceedings that followed Rayshard Brooks' death became one of the most highly watched cases in the nation. The charges brought against Officer Garrett Rolfe and Officer Devin Brosnan served as a litmus test for the criminal justice system. His ability to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct, the rare decision to charge a police officer with felony murder in an on-duty shooting was seen as a step toward accountability, but the prosecution faced significant challenges in bringing the officers to trial. Rayshard Brooks's death occurred in the context of broader calls for justice for Black lives, especially after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The prosecution in Atlanta hoped that Brooks' case would send a clear message to law enforcement agencies across the country that officers would face legal consequences for their actions if they used excessive or unjustifiable force. However, the defense for the officers involved argued that they had acted in self-defense and that Brooks's resistance to arrest and his use of a weapon against the officers justified their actions. The trial was closely followed by civil rights organizations, activists, and the public, who hoped that justice for Brooks would become a catalyst for more widespread reform in law enforcement. Many believed that a conviction for the officers involved in Brooks' death could help shift the narrative around police violence and show that law enforcement officers were not above the law. Yet, given the complexities of the case and the charged emotions surrounding it, the trial also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting police officers for misconduct. As the trial moved forward, it became clear that the issue of police accountability was much more complicated than many had hoped. Legal experts and observers feared that the defense might have a strong case, especially given the debate over whether Brooks posed a direct threat to the officers. The case raised difficult questions about what constitutes reasonable use of force and whether police officers should be held to a higher standard when they use lethal force. Rayshard Brooks' death left a lasting impact on both the city of Atlanta and the country as a whole. His death prompted further discussions about the need for systemic change, particularly when it came to policing, race relations, and justice in America. Brooks' story became part of a larger narrative that demanded justice for Black lives and aimed to address the deep racial disparities that have long defined American policing. Through the efforts of his family, activists, and the larger social justice movement, Brooks' death became a powerful symbol of resistance against police violence. His case, alongside other high-profile incidents, helped galvanize a new generation of activists committed to ensuring that future generations would not experience the same injustices. The growing momentum for police reform and the reimagining of public safety systems created space for new conversations about justice in the U.S. As part of his legacy, the Rayshard Brooks Foundation, established by his family, continues to work toward eliminating police violence and empowering communities. The foundation supports various initiatives aimed at supporting families impacted by police brutality, providing educational opportunities, and advocating for changes to law enforcement practices. Despite the legal challenges and divisive opinions surrounding the case, Rayshard Brooks' death marked a critical moment in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in the United States. The aftermath of his killing propelled the conversation about police reform forward, pushing local governments and law enforcement agencies to take a deeper look at how they engage with communities, particularly communities of color. The Atlanta Police Department, in particular, was forced to reconsider its practices. In the wake of Brooks's death, a renewed emphasis on accountability and reform within the department became evident. The termination of Officer Garrett Rolfe and the charges against both him and Officer Devin Brosnan, though controversial, underscored the willingness of certain institutions to hold officers accountable for their actions. This was a rare moment, given the historical tendency for law enforcement agencies to protect officers accused of misconduct. It sent a clear message that, at least in some cases, officers would face consequences for excessive use of force. Despite this, many activists felt that the charges were not enough. For them, the systemic nature of police brutality and the larger problem of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system required deeper, more comprehensive reform than the prosecution of individual officers. Brooks' death, alongside other incidents of police violence, became a focal point for calls to dismantle or restructure existing law enforcement systems, advocating for community-based policing, increased oversight, and other measures to reduce the likelihood of future tragedies. One of the most significant outcomes of Brooks's death was the amplification of the movement to defund the police. While the phrase itself was heavily debated, its core message, redistributing resources from law enforcement to community services, resonated with many who believed that addressing the root causes of crime, such as poverty, education, and mental health, would reduce the reliance on police forces and minimize the potential for violence. Activists argued that by shifting funds toward social services, the country could create safer communities that were not reliant on a militarized police force. In the months following Brooks' death, there was a shift in how cities began to approach their Relationships with law enforcement. Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd was killed, became one of the first major cities to officially endorse defunding the police, with the city council announcing its intent to dismantle the police department. While the specifics of this decision were still in flux, the movement spread rapidly to other parts of the country. Some cities, like Los Angeles and New York, redirected funds away from police departments toward mental health services and community initiatives. The defunding movement also gained international attention, with solidarity protests held in other parts of the world. Demonstrators in cities across the globe echoed the calls for justice for Brooks and other victims of police violence. It was clear that the demand for systemic change was not confined to the U.S. Rather, it resonated on a global scale. However, the call to defund the police was met with resistance from many law enforcement officials and political figures. Some argued that reducing police budgets would lead to an increase in crime and hinder law enforcement's ability to protect communities. This sparked heated debates about how to achieve a balance between public safety and accountability, and whether alternatives to traditional policing could effectively address crime and disorder. Nonetheless, the conversation about the role of police in society continued to dominate political discourse. Rayshard Brooks' death came during a time of profound cultural reckoning in the U.S., particularly regarding race relations and the treatment of Black Americans. The summer of 2020 saw some of the largest protests in American history, with millions of people participating in demonstrations, calling for an end to systemic racism. The Black Lives Matter movement, founded in 2013, in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer, grew exponentially in the wake of George Floyd's death. Rayshard Brooks' case was a crucial part of the momentum behind these protests, as it represented yet another life taken too soon and unjustly by law enforcement. The tragic event sparked a reevaluation of how the U.S. public perceives the criminal justice system and law enforcement. The protests weren't just about police brutality. They were a broader demand for justice in all aspects of American life. From education to housing to healthcare, the larger conversation about race and inequality began to shift as more people began to acknowledge the depth of systemic racism within institutions. Brooks' death, along with other incidents, revealed the deep, pervasive nature of these inequalities and called into question the ways in which American society had failed to confront these issues head-on. Corporations, political leaders, and public figures were forced to respond. Many companies, particularly those in the entertainment and tech industries, issued public statements condemning police violence and expressing solidarity with the movement for racial justice. Some brands even committed to making long-term changes in their hiring practices, funding initiatives to combat racial inequality, and increasing diversity and inclusion efforts. The arts and culture also played a significant role in bringing attention to these issues. Artists, musicians, filmmakers, and writers rallied to express their support for the movement and to demand change. In Atlanta, several cultural institutions, including the Atlanta Hawks basketball team and the Georgia State University College of Law, organized events to honor Rayshard Brooks and others who had fallen victim to police violence. As the months went by, the legal case against Officer Garrett Rolfe and Officer Devin Brosnan continued to unfold. The prosecution faced the difficult task of proving that the use of deadly force was not justified, and legal experts speculated about the challenges they would face in court. The defense maintained that Rolfe had acted in self-defense, given the threat posed by Brooks allegedly aiming the taser at the officers. The case also highlighted the difficulty of bringing police officers to justice. While the charges against Rolfe and Brosnan were rare, they raised broader questions about the accountability of law enforcement officials. For many in the Black community and among activists, there was a lingering skepticism that the criminal justice system could deliver a fair outcome in cases involving police officers. Past cases in which officers were acquitted despite clear evidence of wrongdoing only deepened this distrust. At the same time, the ongoing legal proceedings and protests provided an opportunity for politicians to take stronger stances on police reform. Many local politicians who had been slow to act in the past were now compelled to take a harder look at their own policies and relationships with law enforcement. Some city councils moved to pass legislation aimed at reducing police violence, including bans on chokeholds, restrictions on no-knock warrants, and the creation of independent civilian review boards. These reforms, though limited, were seen as crucial steps in the broader movement to ensure that the deaths of individuals like Rayshard Brooks would not be in vain. Rayshard Brooks' death, like so many others, became a pivotal moment in the American struggle for racial justice and equality. The events that followed his death, including the national protests, the legal case, and the renewed calls for reform, were part of a larger, ongoing movement that sought to reshape the relationship between police and the communities they are meant to serve. While much work remains to be done, Brooks's legacy continues to inspire people around the world to take action. His death became a rallying cry for those who believe that the time for change has come. His name, like those of other victims, will continue to be remembered as a symbol of the struggle for justice. In the years to come, the lessons learned from the fight for justice for Rayshard Brooks and countless others will shape the future of policing, public safety, and the broader conversation about race in America. As activists and advocates continue their work, they do so with the memory of Rayshard Brooks in their hearts, fighting for a world in which such tragedies are no longer a reality. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of real crime. We appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your support. Now, it's time to leave the darkness behind and embrace the calm. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the sound of gentle rain guide you into a peaceful sleep. Until next time, stay safe and take care.